Hello, good evening. My name is Jorge Garriz. I'm a programmer for Fringe, Queer Film and Art Fest. Welcome to the second screening of our program Queer Eyes, organized by the Royal Anthropologists Institute and Fringe. I hope you have enjoyed the documentary. If you couldn't watch it, it's available until tomorrow, so please watch it. This screening is part of Film Fields Connected, a UK-wide cinema season supported by the National Lottery and BFI Film Audience Network. So thank you to them. Just a little reminder that next Wednesday will be our last screening, which the documentary is Miro Miro. And the documentary is about a London queer club called Whatever. And it used to promote itself a club as all genders and sexualities. Sorry. Now I'm going to pass you to my colleague Jennifer, who will be the host of the Q&A. So enjoy. Thank you.
Hi everyone, thank you for joining us this evening. My name is Jennifer Cairns. I am a fellow in public anthropology at the Royal Anthropological Institute, and I am delighted to host this conversation this evening. So I hope you all got a chance to watch the film, but like Jorge mentioned, it will be available until tomorrow in case you want to go and rewatch it after our discussion. And joining me to talk about it this evening, we have the filmmaker Angelica Cabezas Pino, Will Nutland, and Roberto Tovar. So I think I'll just let you guys introduce yourself a little bit. So Angelica, why don't you go first and tell us a little bit about yourself?
Okay, hello everyone. My name is Angelica. I'm currently living in the UK, but I originally come from Chile. And I don't know what else I should say about myself. I finished my PhD in anthropology. And the product of that fantastic experience was the film This Is My Face that you just watched.
Fantastic, thank you. And how about Will? Would you like to go next?
Hi, good evening. I'm Will Nutland. I'm the co-founder of an HIV prevention, education and activist project called Prepster. And I'm a PrEP user myself. I'm also an academic and a researcher. I spend a little bit of my time based at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. It's really lovely to be here this evening.
Thank you. And last but not least, Roberto, could you introduce yourself a little bit, please?
Sure. Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here. I run a project called Número de Serie, which the idea behind is to use art and design to create awareness around HIV, sexual health, sex positivity, and all the good things about having sex. I'm HIV positive, and yeah, I just want to share my story as well as a way of creating awareness. So here I am.
Brilliant. Well, thank you all so much for joining us. And just a reminder to everyone watching at home that this is also a participatory discussion. So please submit your questions to our panel. You can do that by putting it in the chat underneath the video, and I will do my best to try and refer them across to the panelists as and when they come in. But while we wait for that, I thought it might be helpful if we could just start by getting a little bit of context about the film, perhaps. So Angelica, I thought it would be great if you could tell us a little bit about what inspired you to make the film, and also maybe a little bit about the process of getting access into this community and making quite a sort of difficult film in many ways.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, well, the idea comes from many different points that kind of like collapsed at some point when I wanted to do my PhD. So the first takes me back, the first kind of like experience that I had that kind of like pushed me to start to work on this research was that one of my dear friends was diagnosed with HIV. And when he told me that he was living with HIV, I didn't know what to say, right? And I didn't know what to say. And that really makes me question, all the things that I knew until that point. So I had access to education. I didn't have, a kind of like extremely difficult life. I also lived with an illness, with a chronic illness, but I didn't know what to say. And that kind of like really freaks me out. And I started to look around. That was maybe 20 years ago. And I started to look around. I was at that point living in Chile, and I started to look around, and I realized that there was so much stigma, and that stigma also affected people living with other syndromes and illnesses. So I started to conduct research on that. And then it got to a point when I really wanted to produce something that was in this kind of like interface between anthropology and activism. And so to kind of like push this idea that we really need to engage with more interventionist ways of doing social sciences. And so, yeah, everything kind of like became alive and clear that we needed to work together on this project. And the project was actually quite long, was longer than the PhD. Some of the guys who are on the film, I already met them before starting to work on this research. But it took me quite a long time to get under the skin of the different groups and communities. So what was usually happening, and I think that is so telling about the kind of like impact of stigma, is that many people were like, yeah, oh, this is really important. We really need to do something against stigma, and I'm happy for you to share my story, to tell you my story. All that is fine, but please don't ask me to be on camera, or please don't ask me to show my face. And so it took me quite a long time to not only to get positive responses, but at the same time to really engage in an ethical way in which people were really making decisions with the consciousness that this could have some impact in their lives. So it was a long process. Many different things collapsed in kind of like the same project. Shared experiences as well. But it was quite interesting how things were developing and were moving from point A to point B. And yeah.
Thank you. And I want to get into some of those things a little bit more, but before we do, I also thought it might be helpful if we could just talk a little bit about the kind of cultural context of this film. So Chile and Latin America a bit more broadly. So both Angelica and Roberto, I wonder if you could just reflect a little bit on, I guess, kind of broadly speaking, what it means to be either LGBTQ or to sort of be experiencing HIV in that cultural context.
You want to go first, Angelica?
Roberto, we can do paper, scissors, stone. You go first.
Okay. Well, growing up in Mexico, in Mexico City, actually, I feel like I have the kind of the privilege of being in the city, so my experience is a lot different from other parts and other regions in Mexico. But there is obviously like the religious aspect, and it has, even though, like, for example, my whole family, we grew up Catholics, but we don't really practice, or we don't go to church. But there is like growing up in shame and all this, like what is people gonna say, and my close friends, if they knew, and there's this relation with also like how do you contract, or how do you get HIV, which like is immediately related to sex, and sex is kind of like a bad word in and also desire. It's also like a really like people are just like not wanted to have that word in their universe, you know, like so I feel it's yeah, I think it's probably that, like religion and the society. I don't know how it is in Chile. I think it must be something similar, but
it's very similar. I mean, I think you mentioned a very key word, and it's shame. And we are constantly dealing with shame. And even though, you know, as you said that your family, they are Catholic, but they don't practice, it's the same for my family. And I bet, and I know it's the same for many, many people. Like, oh yeah, we declare ourselves Catholics. We deal with that shame. We, you know, give that shame to the new generation. We trespass that. But at the same time, you know, kind of like the religious practices, you don't, what I'm trying to say is that you don't really need to be super religious to feel that shame or the weight of that, so the social control that comes with shame. But at the same time, in Chile, there are also other elements. So this film was filmed in 2016. So that was in a moment in which in Chile there was a lot of, you know, social movements that were, you know, that already started, but still were not strong enough. So I don't know whether you know, but last year there was like a massive uprising of people in Chile, but that's 2019. Before that, there were like, you know, pockets of people really calling, you know, for attention and really denouncing inequalities, generally speaking. But up until that point, and even now, the weight and the weight and all this kind of like scars left by dictatorship are super visible, right? And but what I mean by that is that people use and this, you know, may also want to add something on this. This is related to silence and to manage silence and disclosure, right? So dictatorship ended in 1989. And you know, when you were growing up during dictatorship, you learn that you had to be super careful with whatever thing you said. So that meant that you were constantly, you know, kind of like assessing, should I say something that maybe, you know, inadvertently could put someone that I love in danger. So imagine like those two elements coming together, this kind of like super strong awareness about how to negotiate silence and disclosure about whatever issue, sexuality, medical diagnosis, political tendency, whatever, with the Catholic upbringing, with the weight of shame, plus a very strong, kind of like a massive lack of education, lack of sexual education. So it's like the perfect storm, and it's the perfect storm. And this is how, you know, now in the last years in Chile, there's been declared like an epidemiological emergency because the number of cases of new people living with HIV has rocketed. And you can see, you know, like all these three elements coming together. And yeah.
So something I found very, I guess, poignant about the film is that from that sort of silence, as you were saying, which has also got this sort of historical context in Chile, I think the film really demonstrates the power of storytelling and how that can be used to affect change, even from quite kind of relatively small voices. And Will, I know that this is something that you work with a lot, about the power of storytelling. So I wondered if you could talk a little bit about the role of storytelling in this kind of space.
Yeah, and before I do, I just want to reflect on what Angelica's just said about shame and stigma, because for me, what really resonated when I watched the film this afternoon was that you've got those threads of shame and stigma through all of the characters, but for me, the flip side of shame and stigma is resilience. And I think what I found so moving about your film is that the guys who are featured in it have turned those really challenging, difficult situations into something so, excuse the pun, so positive. And the resilience we see there is what moved me so strongly. And it's resilience through storytelling. And for me, that's the other thing that really made the film so compelling, that you've used storytelling to educate the viewer about what it is like, not just to live with HIV or to have an HIV diagnosis in Chile, but across the whole of that region and probably globally. And I would challenge anyone, wherever they live, not to have had some level of kind of connection with one or more of your characters. And in Prepster, we use storytelling as a way of pushing people who are either living with HIV or are using PrEP or are thinking of using PrEP, or for whom they wanted to use PrEP, but it's too late for them to use PrEP. We elevate those voices of people as a way of education, but also kind of like a way of political activism. It means that if someone is telling their story about their own decision to start using PrEP, the journey that they went on, that's a much more powerful, resonating story than if, example, a doctor wrote on our website about what it's like taking PrEP. Not to say that the voice of a doctor isn't important, but we do a lot of, or pre-COVID, we were doing a lot of real world panel discussions, often in clubs and bars. And our policy on all of those panels is that we would always make sure that the majority of people on the panels were PrEP users themselves. If the theme was about PrEP, if it's about living with HIV, the majority had to be people living with HIV. But if we focus on PrEP for a second, we always get the question from the audience, oh, well, I'd like to think about using PrEP, but I've heard you get really bad side effects. Now, if that response is answered by a doctor is generally going to tell you what some peer-reviewed journal article said, or the view of that doctor that they've heard from a handful of their clients, of patients. If one of us who's using PrEP answers that question, we can do the same thing, but we can also talk from our own experience. Like, when I started PrEP, this happened to me. And that level of personal storytelling is so in these issues that you've already raised as being quite taboo or stigma inducing. And when Prepster gets calls or emails from people in different parts of the world saying, can you help us think about how we might educate and agitate for PrEP where I live, the first thing we tell people is try to elevate the voices of people who are either using PrEP or want to use PrEP right to the forefront of everything that you do, and use that power, use that resilience.
So we have one of our first questions in from the audience. So I thought I'd start with this question from Martha, which is for Angelica, but then I think we can sort of broaden it out. So Martha says that they love the film. What inspired you to work in this style with the photographic retracing of memories? And then I guess more broadly, I'd love to hear both Will and Roberto talk a little bit about how kind of photography, art more broadly, can be so evocative and can be used as a form of activism. But first, Angelica, like, why did you decide to trace photography as your way of making the film?
Yeah, well, so basically, as I said, this came up from my PhD research. So I was, looking for methodological ways in which you could start to narrate, as Will was saying, to narrate yourself, to tell your story, to narrate yourself in a situation or in a context where you were not allowed to do so, or to do so, to talk about your experiences was very risky. And then that was also in relationship with the fact that there has been historically a lot of invisibility and a lot of silence. So how can we devise some methodological practice by which we could contest silence through narration, and we could contest invisibilities through images, right? So then it came about this idea of trying to work together in a process of storytelling, of visual storytelling, using photography in this case, but could have been, another another format, using storytelling to narrate yourself. So we could create a form of collaborative sense-making process. So we were constantly, what was happening in the field is that the guys were creating and crafting these images, these representations about their lives and their experiences. And they were holding the photographic camera, which was an analog camera. And there is a reason for that, why they're using an analog camera. I can tell you later if you want. So they were holding the analog camera, and now we were holding the video camera. So the idea is that we were engaging in a dialogue about images. So I was not asking them questions about their previous experiences. So the idea was that they could decide what they were going to narrate and how to narrate that. So we were engaged in a discussion about images, and that is based on the idea that, you know, people, if you facilitate and if you create and if you co-create a specific context, people can be their best theorists. Just to kind of like relate to some anthropological debates, I honestly believe in that. So it's a matter of facilitating that context in which people can feel safe to tell their stories, and use creative methods, as you know, going back to something that also Will was saying, to evoke or to bring into the conversation all that resilience that is there, that is already there. So this is how it came about. This idea of contesting invisibility and contesting silence at the same time, but at the same time also inviting them to take part in a journey in which they had control, in which I was there present with the camera, but they had control of what they wanted to narrate. So there are no kind of like interviews, but rather a conversation about images. So why did you decide to place the camera there? Why are you using these props? And I don't know. Why do you want to be on camera? Are you going to be on camera? And if so, why? So this is how it came about.
Thank you. Roberto, I know you use art a lot in your own practice and reflecting about what it means to live with HIV. So could you talk a little bit then about why you use art in your activism?
To be honest, I think it was something similar to what Will mentioned, because it was to find a way of connect with people that is not in a clinical or in a thought in a board room kind of action, you know, like it's not a campaign that is being thought by a group of like people being like, yeah, this is how we need to talk to them. It's like it's literally like somebody's work and somebody's story as well, you know. And as Will said, I think, or at least how it was in my case, how I kind of like started getting more involved, and it was because I started seeing that resonate a little bit more and directly to me. So yeah, it is. And also, you know what, like art as art therapy, you know, like as a way of coping with certain issues, you know. Like I ran a workshop once with a charity here in London called Metro, and they work with Latin American communities. And we created once a HIV Pride flag, which it was very like, you think about it and it's like very arts and crafts and like I don't know, like school work, but it was actually quite healing and listening to other people's stories. Why are you choosing that color? Why are you choosing that shape? So it has a healing property or a healing side. So that I think that's why it's important.
There was actually a quote that I wrote down when I was watching the film again earlier this morning, which was that one of the guys says, "This photo is like coming out into the light," which kind of really struck me. Actually, partly also because I guess it made me realize that for many of these people living with stigma, it's like a double burden almost of having to come out twice. Many of them have already had to come out in terms, or been outed in terms of their sexuality, and then there's this additional sort of outing that they have to go through. So Angelica, again, I wonder if you could sort of say something a little bit about what some of these people were feeling as they were taking some of these photos. And you show very poignantly some of the wider family context as well, but sort of also some of the other people who maybe don't appear in the film so much, but what their relatives thought about the process as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think maybe also Will and Roberto, they can talk about or they can talk about this idea of a second coming out. But I guess what I can tell you is that it was so interesting to see how through this collaboration they were kind of like really getting into this embodiment of taking control of their representation and of their image. That was something really interesting to observe. So at the beginning, it was like, a bit like, okay, here is the camera, and you could see in one of the sequences when Gato we are in his bedroom, and he's kind of like trying to pass me the camera, and I'm like, okay, but you need to make the decisions. Like you have to make the decisions about where should I be, and then once you have decided that, I can help you, but the idea is that you frame yourself. And then from there, from kind of like that sort of reaction, original, initial moment, that moved to a situation in which they were, questioning me like, why are you filming from there? So they moved to kind of like being scared of the photographic camera to actually making decisions and about the film we were making, and why we're filming the way that we were filming. So that was kind of like super, super, super interesting. And then also another element was the fact that at the beginning, I think from what they told me, the reasons for which they were engaging in the project was actually because they wanted to reflect about their experiences, and kind of like work together on this journey of sense making and so on. But then it became so clear for all of them that what actually they wanted to do was that they wanted to talk to other people. So they wanted to use the film and the photos as a platform to communicate with others. Not only people who were living with HIV, but people who were not living with HIV, people who thought that they haven't met anyone living with HIV, they were really interested in doing that. And then it got to a point when they wanted to talk to, everyone. When we were at the exhibition, and then when the film was premiered in Chile, and they took part in the premiere, it was like a super very emotional moment, but also a moment in which they were not only, they went from holding the camera to the experience of holding the microphone and, speaking to people and being asked questions for the first time. And that kind of like, how things were changing from the first moment in which they grab the camera and they feel like a bit like, whoa, uncomfortable because it's like something that you're not used to carry around, to that moment in which they're, like grabbing the microphone and talking to people, and they're still doing that, or running workshops now, for other people, like similar workshops around storytelling and autobiography to other people living with HIV. I mean, that's a massive achievement.
Mm-hmm.
I think you can notice in Diego and Claudio how from the beginning of the film and then like in the end how you can even see them like even their posture when they're talking and when he's reading is like almost like there's a clear before and after. So you can see almost like empowerment in his work. So it's incredible to see that.
Mm-hmm.
So Will, I wondered actually if you could perhaps share a little bit about how you found the process of sort of working with people and sort of helping them to share their stories.
And just before I do, just to, in that theme that Angelica and Roberta's just talked about, I've got a note from when I watched the film this afternoon, and I think, is it Miguel who's on the bench with his mother?
Yeah.
And he uses the quote, "I'm not ashamed anymore." And that was so powerful. That was the bit when, for me, the tears started. And I think what Roberto's just observed with, you know, the changes in people's body language and the grabbing of the mic, this whole project seems to have taken those guys through a journey of losing their shame. And when we lose shame, all of the things that we've observed at the end of the film, that art exhibition, which in itself is just so powerful, really resonated as losing our shame, no longer being ashamed of what I'm told I should be ashamed of. And Jen, that's my observation of the work that we do in Prepster and the work that I've done over the last 25 years around sexual health, is when you can, we've almost always used some form of artwork in the work we've done, and it's not usually the end, it's not the output, it's not the product that you end up with, whether it's a photograph or a fanzine or a banner, that's the most important thing. It's the journey and the process that you take people on. And the art that the examples of art that we've just been talking about follow a really rich seam of how art has been at the forefront of HIV and sexual health activism for almost 40 or more years, and in a time when we didn't have social media and the internet in the way that we do now, some of those very early forms of education and activism quite literally involved putting art together to go and fly post on walls of towns and cities, or to put stickers up, or to create banners so that we could get our point across. And if you haven't got a good looking piece of artwork, then people aren't going to engage with it. And I look at some of the historical work that people like Grand Fury did at the beginning of ACT UP, some of the work that a group called Devo did, which was Damn Interfering Video Activists, which is a bunch of lesbians who would film stuff that kind of went on to help formulate the work of the Lesbian Avengers. All of this rich seam of using artwork in some format, I think is kind of the trajectory that this film shows that we're now on, and I think it's beautiful, and we should celebrate it.
And I think our audience agrees with us. I'm just looking at some of the comments that have come in, and it definitely resonates. So Luis Amalia says, it was beautiful how in the film, the creation of these images made them recreate these stories again, and by reacting them again, with the perspective that time gives. He says, amazing meta moments. And then also we have another comment from Joanne, that the quote that resonated with them the most was when Claudio says, this picture is a memory scar. It's not an open wound anymore, but it's still there. Yeah, I was also very struck, Will, by that moment in the park, lying on the mother's lap. Angelica, have you had the chance to follow up with any of these people a little bit further? I mean, have you stayed in touch with them at all?
Yeah. Well, I talk with them almost. With some of them, I talk every week.
Oh.
They're my friends. Can
you tell us a little bit about how the film was received in Chile, and when they saw the film and sort of watched themselves taking photos on a film again and sort of watched it with a second layer, kind of how that went?
Well, that is also a process, because I don't think anyone is kind of like, I personally don't feel comfortable when I see myself on screen. And I think it was the same for them, in the sense that, oh my God, the comments were at the beginning like, oh my God, I'm on this, massive screen now. Oh, I didn't realize my voice sounded like that. And once we overcame those comments, I think it was a very positive experience for everyone. And just because something that Will was, mentioning before, like this idea of, telling your stories and use the power of storytelling to overcome shame. I mean, when we disclose or when we come out, we are not allowing someone else to have power over us anymore. We are completely out of their control. So there is something so liberating about that. There is something so beautiful about, not allowing someone else to control how you should relate to yourself in a very kind of like intimate and private dialogue. So when you do that in a cinema on a big screen, it's a massive moment, and I think it was very positive for all of them, and for their families as well.
There's something I think that I, as an anthropologist, admired about the film was the way that you kind of made, I guess, your ethics and that participatory nature of it so inherent in the methodology. So, I mean, yeah, sorry, everybody, if anthropology is super boring for everybody else, but I'm kind of very interested in it's a big topic in anthropology, right, about the fact that we kind of march into other people's lives and ask them to tell us their stories, in these cases, quite traumatic stories, and then our job is to somehow relate them. And I loved how you had made this a very participatory film, and actually it's far more about them exploring their own story and deciding how they want to present that. So I wondered if you could maybe just touch a little bit about on that sort of line between, on the one hand, sort of academia and anthropology and storytelling, but on the other hand, this sort of activism and your sort of more participatory methodology.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, that is a very kind of like important point. So don't feel alone, Jenny. That is also very important for me. And it's the fact that I personally don't engage as a social scientist and filmmaker in the field or as part of my projects in a way in which I feel detached from people. Like I go there to offer an experience that we are going to co-create. So it's not only me who is asking questions, we are asking questions and we are collaborating in creating something in which we all had been honest. So at the beginning, I was super honest with them in saying, well, guys, I don't know where we're going to get with this. I think it's a good idea and we can give it a go. But I don't think that social scientists, especially now in these current times, we can be detached from thinking creatively about social justice, about social change, about collaborating with people in ways that are not hierarchical. So yeah, that's the sort of like that's the sort of research project I like to be involved in. I don't, my audience are not other anthropologists. That's only part of my audience. My audience are people who are interested in reflecting and thinking critically about different issues. So this is, the method comes after that. How we define and design method. That is a question that then comes after we have agreed that this is how we want to collaborate with each other. And I'm kind of like sick and tired of people parachuting, social scientists parachuting in and out from places and not really engaging in a horizontal and straightforward way with people. We are yeah.
Yes, I wholeheartedly agree, and I can see Will nodding. So I wondered, Will, I know you also sort of come from within academia, so I wondered if you also had any reflections on any of that.
Yeah, I mean that last sentence, total resignation there. The idea of social scientists, and not just social scientists, parachuting in. I mean, the panel and audience members invite us all to reflect on any research project that we've been involved in as a participant in the last couple of years, and wonder, did we ever get to find out what happened to the research we participated? What are the findings? How does that impact on our lives? And it's actually really rare for researchers and academics to engage with their participants, their target group, their audience, quite in the way that we've seen here. My own experience was that as I was getting to the end of my doctorate, which was on the acceptability of PrEP amongst men in London, it became really clear that I had to do something with that research that made a change. And although I had a whole set of recommendations for how institutions, governments, organizations might foster that change, I actually knew that I had a whole load of data, really personal data, that these guys had shared with me about how they might want to use PrEP and the impact that PrEP could have on them. And so I actually, I was a little bit late submitting my final doctoral thesis, because instead I worked with 3 other people to set PrEPster up, and kind of the first iteration of PrEPster is pretty much based on the data from my doctoral research, with guys telling us what it was they needed to know about PrEP. So yeah, more research like this. If there are any research funders out there, I think this should kind of be, this should be a condition of funding.
Any research funders out there, can you please make yourself known in the comments? Actually, I mean, this is, I guess, a question for all of you then, but it strikes me that all of you sort of are, I guess you could say, interdisciplinary in the way that you go about your activism. So Angelica, you have your filmmaking, and you're an anthropologist, of course. Will, you were talking about, of course, you're an academic, but also an activist. And Roberto, you have all of your art practice. So I wonder if any of you have faced criticism sort of from home, if you like. I know that in anthropology, we are not always the kindest to each other, for example.
Mm-hmm. You want to go?
A little bit.
You're on camera, so go.
I mean, I don't think I haven't get a criticism, but this is probably something that I put on myself, and it's like, why are you like doing, like, my project originally started as to try to work with HIV in Mexico, but living in the UK was just like it wasn't gonna happen. And I don't know, I get like, like trying to fix other house problems when I feel a little bit of like I should be looking at things that are happening in Mexico, because the UK is like taken care of already, you know what I mean? But at the end of the day, is like work can be done everywhere, and it's needed still. But yeah, I think it's probably just that, like kind of like thinking of why am I doing this work in here and not in Mexico? But it's a personal reflection rather than someone in there like criticizing. Yeah.
And Will, any I don't like the word backlash, but have you had to sort of pick sides ever?
Firstly, I'm really glad that you're doing your work here, Roberto, not in Mexico, because otherwise you wouldn't be around so much. I think a really topical and relevant backlash right now is that PrEPster and its parent company is called the Love Tank, it's a community interest company. We've spent the last 4 months with, obviously, like lots of us, with a COVID focus, and we've put out a whole stack of information about risk reduction strategies around sex in the COVID lockdown era, including information on stopping and starting PrEP, information on how to get hold of PrEP, information about living with HIV in the COVID era. And we come from a really rich and proud tradition of harm reduction or risk reduction. And that's what health promotion is about. It's about helping to give people choices. It's not about taking control away from people. And 3 months ago, we put out a set of how to how to reduce COVID harm during sex during this COVID period, with an acknowledgement that that there are risks, there are COVID-related risks in meeting up for sex, but an acknowledgement that no matter how much we tell people that they shouldn't do that, we know that people are having sex. So we need to live with that reality. And so we put out a whole set of harm reduction information and had a very split response. We were told by some other HIV organizations and activists that was irresponsible. I received emails of complaint. And the best thing was that though we had responses from people around the world saying, we're really glad that you're one of the few organizations doing this. Organizations have copied, translated that information and those materials. And sure enough, what are we finding? Piece of research we were involved in found that in the first 6 weeks of lockdown, about 25% of gay guys have had some sex. And we've got feedback that the information we've put out has helped people to reduce their COVID risk. Why am I saying this now? Because I think, again, there's a rich thread that follows through from all of the early days of HIV, when people were being told you shouldn't have sex, you shouldn't have sex with certain types of people, you should use a condom every time. And the what I call the kind of the Nancy Reagan just say no kind of ways of thinking about drugs and sex in the 80s and 90s is now being placed upon sex during the COVID era, and we know it doesn't work. So that's the challenge I'm currently dealing with.
And Will, just in case anybody watching this would like to take a look at some of those resources that you've got, where can we go?
Yeah, we can go to prepster.info/COVID. And also, if you live in London and you haven't had an STI test, including a syphilis test, since the beginning of lockdown, you can get a free postal test sent directly to your door with results back within a couple of days. And to get that, if you go to syph.shl.uk, so syph.shl.uk.
Thank you. And we'll try and make sure those links go up at the end as well. Okay, well, I am very aware of time. I think we only have time for one final question, which brings the spotlight back onto you, Angelica. It's a very artsy question. Angelica, are you going to use this meta-palimpsest procedure to create more films? It was very interesting to see the territory between still photography and the moving image of film. There you go, setting a high tone for the end of the conversation.
Yeah, can I mention something before I answer to that one? So that now that we started to talk about COVID, I just wanted to mention that HIV affects people in such a different ways in different parts of the world. What is happening now in Chile is that people are not getting access to antiretroviral therapy. And the government made a promise that they would receive for access to medication for many months, so they didn't have to go out, because in Chile what happens is that every month you get your medication. That hasn't happened, and there are people who are now under lockdown with military presence on the street, and they can't go out, and they don't have their therapy. So I just wanted to mention that, because I think that is it's a massive issue. It's a massive issue. So the government, have been kind of like really proudly said, like, oh, well, now people have access to therapy, we've done our job, really not considering that HIV has so many other different dimensions. They don't provide any sort of, psychosocial care, guidance. And that for me is violence, is a form of violence. But now they're not even providing the antiretroviral therapy, so that is a really important issue. So COVID is affecting people living with HIV in different parts of the world in different ways. Having said that, going back to the question, I hope I really hope. And for that we need to get funding, but I think it also the kind of like good thing about using that using developing methods is the fact that you engage in conversation with people, and then you realize that there are formats and ways of working that, you know, have to emerge from those conversations. So for me, it's not like, oh, now we have set up this method, then I'm going to go in different parts of the world and use the same, you know. It has to be adapted. It has, you know, we may not end up using photography, or we may not end up using film, or we may end up just integrating something else. I don't know. But it would be great. But for that, we need the funding.
Yeah. Well, on that very pragmatic note, I think that unfortunately draws this very interesting conversation to a close. So thank you all again for joining me. So thanks again to Angélica Cabezas Pino, the anthropologist and filmmaker behind Esta es mi cara, to Will Nutland from Prepster, and to Roberto Tovar from Número de Serie. My name is Jennifer Cairns, and thank you for joining us. And a little reminder as well that if you still want to watch the film again, which you should, for a second time, it's available until tomorrow on the RAI website. And please join us again here at the same time next week, where we will be talking about the last film in our series, which is Mirror Mirror. So I hope you can join us then. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you.